All right. So you don't want to be Aaron Rodgers, right? You don't want to have a hamstring tear. So these are injuries that are very common in sports that require a lot of high velocity running, speed running, sudden movements. Also, people that are doing a lot of sprinting, whether it be track people, dancers will get them. A lot of it will happen with people that have to have a lot of excessive hip flexion, and knee extension. Whether it be a stride or a dancer that's doing a high kick, they have to have that good range of motion, and they're more susceptible to a hamstring tear. There's various grades of tears, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about, before we talk about how to prevent a tear, I'm going to take my top 4 tips at the very end of the video. We're going to talk about a little bit about what you'll see when it happens or what exactly occurs, okay? So one of the things you oftentimes when you have a hamstring tear is you'll get an audible pop. Oftentimes it'll be mid-substance right around here, but it'll be higher into the buttock where the hamstring actually starts, okay? That's where you often hear it. You'll have a sudden loss of range of motion. You all of a sudden you'll alter your gait, you can't walk as far. Often you'll see they can't straighten out their knee as much, especially in more severe cases. Loss of motion at the hamstring, they'll want to stretch it. Sudden loss of motion. When you test the hamstrings, when we test in the clinic here, we're going to do this with Franklin in a moment just to test and see what they look like, they'll all of a sudden not be able to exert much force. The diagnosis is often, it's not an MRI or an X-ray, except in the cases where you think a bone chip has occurred, which is more extreme cases of a hamstring injury. That's more when you get, they call it an avulsion. Basically it chips the bottom here and pulls off. They call it the ischial tuberosity, this really area right through here, often will chip off. And that's when they'll do an MRI and do more of an assessment. But really a diagnosis of a hamstring tear is more related to how they look in the clinic and how the orthopedist or physical therapist, when they evaluate them, how it happened, what were the situations when it occurred, and what do they look like when they move. So one of the things we'll see right here is when Franklin's just going to demonstrate, he's going to lie on his back, and we're going to check what the hamstring differences as far as flexibility may be. So if you lie on your back, we're going to take one of these pillows out, and we're going to check, let's pretend this is the non-injured side right here. I don't know if Franklin has good hamstring flexibility, we're going to find out soon. So let's come in like this, we're going to bend your knee, Franklin, like that. We're simply going to, you're going to relax, you're not going to help me at all. We're going to see how far we can extend. We'll check the back to make sure we're not getting motion from the back. And that's where Franklin's at. It's about the length of his hamstring. The hamstrings are coming from the inside and the outside here. They're running down the back into the buttock, into the glute, just below the fold. They call it the gluteal fold, right about here. That's the length of the hamstring, okay? And as you straighten out the knee, the hamstring gets on more stretch. Also, if you move the hip here, you'll notice you lose a little bit of range of motion here. You're stretching the hamstring a little bit more. Okay, so let's compare it to this side. Let's compare it to the opposite side. Let's pretend that this side now, that was the non-injured, this is the injured side. What you'll typically see is they'll literally won't be able to go beyond this point right here. They're going to have very sharp, they're going to have very acute pain, they're not going to want to do it, they're not going to be happy at all. Okay, so we want to force this, we're just for the assessment, we want to see where we're at. So big loss in motion. On the other side, he had very decent range of motion here, a lot more and pain-free. Okay. The other thing too, let's have you lie on your stomach, Franklin. If we test the hamstring, first we'll just ask him to move it. Say, hey, can you go ahead and move your leg back? Now this is the injured side. We switched up. Let's go good. This is now the good side. So bend your knee back. Great range of motion, non-painful when he does it. Feels pretty good. Brings his leg down. Now let's test the injured side. So Franklin's just going to move up. He's going to sit right about here. And let's say a very severe case, they literally actively they can't move it. This is all the hamstrings flexing the knee. And also hamstrings also extend the hip. That's two of the actions. So when they come up, if they're feeling all right, it's a little bit painful, we'll just do a very light assessment. We'll pull back. Okay, resist me, Franklin. Don't let me move you. Hold your leg there. Don't let me move you. And pull in. And they'll just give way. Relax your leg. And it'll just kind of drop. They will have no strength or power. And they'll often complain of pain in this area. Now, occasionally, there can be different types of injuries that seem like hamstring injuries. But they're actually lower back or sciatica symptoms. So occasionally I've shown this, it wasn't really running. They'll say it happened kind of differently. It wasn't a fast ballistic move. They'll say I just developed this pain. And it'll be right in the hamstrings. They won't even have any buttock or lower back pain, but it's actually sciatica. Now just to understand, the nerves that feed into the hamstrings are sciatic nerve and also the common peroneal. So that can cause some problems and mimic a hamstring injury. So sometimes that is playing into it. Most times, let's say in Franklin's case, he was running in for a football game, an old football game over Thanksgiving with his buddies from high school, and blew it out when he was running. We kind of think that. Sometimes you can have a combination. You can also have an injury that mimics it. But you also look at it, and also heard an audible pop or something immediately to stop that point. You'll also notice his walking isn't great. He can't completely extend his leg like we were talking about earlier. Okay, so those are some of the ways. As far as prevention, listen, not everything can be prevented, but there's some good evidence for prevention of hamstrings using what they call an eccentric strengthening program. So that's one of the core things that I give out, and I'll tell people try and incorporate this into their routine. Now, if you don't have a lot of equipment, we're going to show you something called a Nordic hamstring exercise that Franklin's going to do. Now we're going to pretend Franklin never had an injury, so we're going to come over here to the mat. So Franklin, let's have you stand up. We're going to have him kneel on the ground here, and I'm going to have both his knees here. And if you're working with a trainer or a partner, you can do this with a partner in a gym. You're going to hold the partner's legs here, or right about here. And what you're going to try and do is you want to have the person slowly go forward and just put your hands forward and hinge right about here. You want to keep the back straight and everything's occurring at bending of the knee. So you're going to slowly lower yourself down. So let's try and do that. Okay, and then put your hands up. Good. And then back up. So good control. Eventually, let's try one more for me, Franklin. Good. And what we're getting is an elongation of those hamstrings there. He's trying to control it all the way down. This is not something you want to do every time you work out hamstrings. This is very, very traumatic to the hamstrings. It's something that you have to time. You can't, if you just recently had a hamstring injury, you don't want to immediately go into this. But this is one of the ways to work on eccentrically. That's eccentrically means that the hamstring is elongating. It's essentially the same way it got injured is the way we're trying to work on that strength, is in that lengthening phase of the hamstrings. Okay? So let's try one more before we finish off. So good hand pressure here, all the way forward. Good. And as he gets stronger, he can lower himself pretty much the whole way, or we can even add a little bit of a weight. Let me show you another way you can also do it on the hamstring curl machine. So come on over. So this is a total gym. You've seen this. I forget the old fitness guy that used to do it. I don't remember the old fitness guy. Chuck Norris used to make the. But they're actually a rehab version of this that we can do. So we're going to have you sit down, Franklin. And we're going to make this, put your heels on the top here. I'll make this a little shorter for you. Good. Put your heels up like there. And we're going to essentially have him, he can lay back completely flat. He's going to start out with a little bend in his knees. He's going to go up on two legs, and then he's going to lower just on, let's say, the injured side, or non-injured side in this case, and control it down. 1, 2, 3. Up on two, and lower just on the left side. Perfect. Same idea, and in this particular way, he can do it slowly with a little bit more smaller increments of pressure or stress. When you're doing full body weight there, obviously you need someone that's got pretty good strength, but that's really more for the prevention programs. This is someone that we may do some eccentric strengthening, let's say, after the tear at the appropriate time. And these injuries can take 2 to 3 weeks, 3 or 4 months. There's no clear consensus. You really have to go by the patient. You want a clinician that's kind of paying attention to you so he knows what your tolerance is as far as the return to sport. That's really ultimately the goal. So this is one of the 4 tips as far as that. So eccentric strengthening. Let's have you stand up. The next one here, we're going to have you come back over here, is doing an active warm-up. Okay, so an active warm-up, let's get this out of the way here. An active warm-up prior to competition is a series of, let's say, 10 to 15 minutes of mimicking the type of movements and positions that you're going to be involved with for your sport. For something like basketball, football, rugby, sports are multi-directional movements. You want to have a dynamic warm-up, 10 to 15 minutes prior to competition. You want to be very warmed up. Some of it is just doing, let's say, high knees to chest. I even talked to Franklin about this, but high knees to chest like this. You can also do kickbacks where you're doing. But what you don't want, I guess my point is, you want to be moving the whole time. What you really want to do, and most of the evidence right now is showing you don't want to do a lot of static stretching. So one of the things we want to avoid is doing a lot of sustained stretching where we're just pushing on those hamstrings, long loads, holding it there for 30 or 50 seconds, 60 seconds, and doing that prior to competition. They actually show greater incidence of injury. There's less power. Okay, so there's a lot more problems with it. There are some evidence that say that stretching is good prior to competition. My feeling is it seems like why don't we go more towards the dynamic, just get warmed up, gets good blood flow, 10 to 15 minutes. If you really want to do static stretching, it's just don't do it just prior to competition or something that you're going to be pushing the envelope, doing that full out participation. So think about that, dynamic warm-ups. We'll cover that in another blog as far as what a dynamic workout is. The other thing is good hamstring flexibility is also one of the things we want to look at. So we want to do static stretching, this stretching, but we just don't want to do it just before we go out for that quick run, that football game. Those are the times we want to really do our dynamic warm-ups, not our static stretch. Because when you static stretch, the idea is that you're irritating the muscle a little bit, and that affects its power and its ability to protect you and operate effectively. And your performance is not as great too. So we're looking at one thing is eccentric strengthening is one of our tips. We want to make sure we have good hamstring flexibility, so we want to incorporate good hamstring programs, especially if we're tight. The other thing is we want to make sure our training is sport specific. Okay, so whatever we're doing, we want to mimic those demands. We talked about this earlier on how to prevent injuries in our turkey bowl. We want to make sure that if we're going to go out, we're not just jogging on the treadmill at 3.4 miles per hour. We want to go full out sprints. We want to get ready for that activity. I think certain sports where you're moving all the time, like soccer, you kind of warm up. I think some of the ones with, believe it or not, like dad's softball games or adult softball games or beer leagues. Those guys, they're sitting around for a while, and all of a sudden they take this full-out sprint to get a ball and throw it to first base. For one, they're not warmed up, because they're really getting cold for a while. So they have these long periods in between where they're not ready to participate. So those are some of the things as far as prevention. So we talked about eccentric, we talked about hamstring flexibility, dynamic warm-up, and be specific for your sport. So those are the 4 tips I would say if you try to do something like that. Mimic the demands of what you're going towards, okay? So we have some of those things. You can get on our blog. You can also read our blog. It'll have all the contents of this, and you can read into it. But I wish you luck, and hopefully you won't be that Aaron Rodgers and get injured, okay? Have a great day.